In the summer of 1823, a fur trapper named Hugh Glass was mauled by a grizzly bear in what is now South Dakota. The bear slammed him into the ground along the Grand River and tore into his back so deep that his ribs were visible through the shredded flesh. His throat was ripped open. His leg was broken. His companions killed the bear, but by then Glass was barely breathing. 2 men volunteered to stay behind and wait for him to die. They waited 5 days. Glass kept breathing, so they took his rifle, his knife, and his flint, wrapped him in the bear's hide like a burial shroud, and left. Glass woke up alone, more than 200 miles from the nearest American settlement at Fort Kiowa on the Missouri River. He had no weapons, no tools, and nothing to eat. He set his own broken leg, let the maggots in his wounds stay because they were eating the dead tissue and keeping gangrene from setting in, and started crawling south toward the Cheyenne River, using Thunder Butte as a landmark across the open plains. For 6 weeks, he crawled, stumbled, and eventually floated downstream on a crude raft, surviving on wild berries and whatever scraps of old buffalo meat he could pull from carcasses that wolves had already picked over on the prairie. That story is legendary. Leonardo DiCaprio won an Academy Award playing Hugh Glass in The Revenant. But there was a survival tool from this same era of frontier history that saved far more lives than any single act of individual grit. It had nothing to do with fire, shelter, or fighting off a grizzly bear. And the men who carried it on their belt were the ones who actually lived long enough to tell their stories. To see why it mattered, you need to know what daily life actually looked like for the men who trapped beaver across the American West in the early 1800s. Forget the romantic paintings hanging in frontier museums and the dime novels that turned these men into folk heroes back east. Around 3,000 mountain men worked the Rocky Mountains between 1820 and 1840 during the peak years of the beaver trade. Every morning, they waded into freezing mountain streams to check steel traps set along the banks, sometimes standing waist-deep in water cold enough to cause hypothermia in minutes. They slept in makeshift shelters, caves, or buffalo hide teepees. They carried everything they owned on their backs or on pack horses across mountain passes above the tree line, through rattlesnake-filled canyons, and over river crossings where a single misstep could drown a man and all his equipment. The Blackfeet controlled much of the northern Rockies and the upper Missouri watershed, and they were openly hostile to American trappers. A confrontation between Meriwether Lewis and a group of young Blackfeet warriors in 1806 had left 2 of them dead, and from that point forward, Americans entered Blackfeet territory knowing they might not come out alive. Ambushes were common. Entire trapping parties could lose a season's worth of pelts in a single attack. Jim Bridger, one of the most respected mountain men of his generation, was known to put real stock in dreams, omens, and the advice of native medicine men, because out in that wilderness, superstition and survival looked a lot alike. But the single biggest threat to a mountain man's life was not a grizzly bear, a Blackfeet war party, or a freezing river. It was starvation. Hunting was unreliable. Buffalo herds migrated across hundreds of miles of open prairie and could vanish from a region for weeks at a time. Elk retreated into deep mountain terrain during harsh winters, climbing into elevations that were nearly impossible to reach on foot. Snow buried the roots, berries, and wild onions that supplemented their diet. Mountain man Rufus Sage once claimed that buffalo meat could cure any ailment and restore a dead man to life, but even Sage knew there were long stretches where no buffalo could be found within a week's ride. When game disappeared, trappers resorted to eating anything they could find: boiled rawhide, tree bark, their own moccasins. Some men ate their pack horses. A few starved to death within sight of mountain passes they were too weak to cross. And here is where fire, the thing every modern survival instructor puts at the top of the priority list, actually became a liability. In hostile territory, a cooking fire meant a column of smoke rising above the tree line. In Blackfeet country, that smoke was a signal flare announcing your exact position to warriors who knew every ridge, every valley, and every game trail in the region. A trapper who built a fire in the wrong place at the wrong time was trading warmth and a cooked meal for a very real chance of being discovered, attacked, and killed before morning. So in the worst stretches of winter, when fresh game had disappeared, edible plants were buried under feet of snow, and lighting a fire was as likely to get you killed as the cold was, mountain men needed something they could carry on their belt. Something packed with enough calories to keep a grown man hauling steel beaver traps through waist-deep snow for weeks at a time, and that required no fire, no preparation, and no cooking at all. That something already existed. But first, you need to hear what happened to John Colter, because his story shows exactly what survival looked like without it. Colter was one of the original members of the Lewis and Clark expedition. After the Corps of Discovery returned to St. Louis in 1806, Colter turned right back around and headed into the wilderness alone. He became probably the first American of European descent to explore what is now Yellowstone National Park. The things he described, the geysers shooting boiling water into the sky, the hot springs, the bubbling mud, were so unbelievable that people back east mocked him and called the place Colter's Hell, convinced he was lying. In 1809, while trapping beaver on the Jefferson River in Montana with his partner John Potts, a large Blackfeet war party surrounded their canoe. Potts was killed on the spot, hit with so many arrows that Colter later said they made him look like a riddle. The Blackfeet stripped Colter naked and debated how to kill him. The chief asked Colter if he was a fast runner. Colter, who was actually one of the fastest men among the trappers, lied and said he was slow. The chief walked him out onto an open plain covered in prickly pear cactus, gave him a head start, and turned several hundred warriors loose to chase him down, barefoot and bleeding, with cactus thorns tearing into the soles of his feet. Colter sprinted 6 miles toward the Madison River. Blood poured from his nose from the sheer exertion. One warrior with a spear closed to within 20 yards. Colter stopped, turned, and faced him. The warrior, caught off guard, stumbled and fell, breaking his own spear. Colter grabbed the broken spear point, drove it through the man's chest, took his blanket, and ran the last mile to the river. He dove under a raft of tangled driftwood and found an air pocket where he could keep his head above the freezing water. The Blackfeet searched the riverbank for hours. Some of them walked directly on top of the driftwood where Colter was hiding underneath. After dark, he slipped downstream and started walking, naked, unarmed, with no food and feet that were torn apart beyond recognition. He survived somewhere between 7 and 11 days, depending on which account you read, eating nothing but roots, bark, and wild plants he could identify from knowledge he had picked up living among the Crow people. That is an almost superhuman story, but here is the part that matters. Colter survived through raw endurance, and raw endurance gets you through one crisis. It does not get you through an entire season in the Rockies. The trappers who kept going back into that wilderness year after year, the ones who didn't just survive a single ordeal, but actually functioned, thought clearly, and moved with purpose through conditions that were constantly trying to shut a human body down. They had something Colter didn't have that day on the Jefferson River. They had pemmican. Indigenous peoples across North America, particularly the Cree, the Lakota, and the Métis of the northern plains, had been making it for centuries before the first European trapper ever set foot in the Rocky Mountains. The Cree called it pimikan, from the word pimi, meaning fat or grease. And the knowledge behind it came from generations of expertise passed down by indigenous women who ran the entire production from start to finish, long before any European arrived on the continent. It started with lean bison or elk meat, sliced into thin strips cut against the grain so it would dry faster. Those strips went over low coals or out in the open sun until every trace of moisture was gone and the meat turned brittle, almost like a cracker. Then it was pounded into a fine powder using heavy stones, spread across a tanned hide and beaten until it reached a consistency close to coarse flour. That powder was mixed in roughly equal proportions with rendered bison tallow, and some batches included dried cranberries, Saskatoon berries, or chokecherries for vitamins, and a slight sweetness that cut through the richness of concentrated fat and dried meat. The finished product was pressed into flat cakes or rolled into compact balls that fit in a belt pouch. And this is where pemmican separated itself from every other preserved food available at the time. A single pound of properly made pemmican contained close to 4,000 calories. That is nearly twice the daily caloric needs of an average adult. It provided protein for muscle recovery, fat for sustained energy and warmth, and when berries were included, just enough vitamins to prevent the nutritional deficiencies that crippled men on long wilderness expeditions. You didn't need to cook it. You didn't need to refrigerate it. It didn't spoil in heat, cold, rain, or snow. Stored in dry conditions, pemmican could last for years. Some historical accounts put the shelf life at decades. You could eat it raw while walking the trail. You could boil it into a thick stew called rubaboo. You could fry it in a pan with wild onions, a preparation the plains hunters called rachad. There was nothing else like it in the known world. The mountain men learned about pemmican from the indigenous communities they traded with, lived alongside, and often married into. Those relationships created kinship ties that opened the door to centuries of accumulated wilderness knowledge, everything from building winter shelters to reading weather patterns to using snowshoes to finding edible plants under snow. Pemmican was the most valuable piece of that knowledge, but it wasn't just individual trappers carrying a pouch on their hip. The demand for pemmican created an entire economy, one that has been almost completely forgotten, and the scale of it was staggering. One estimate puts the total consumption at several million kilograms of pemmican per year across the fur trade regions. Entire operations developed around its production. The Métis at Red River would ride out onto the open prairie in massive organized hunts, slaughter bison by the hundreds, process the meat and fat right there on the grassland, and haul the finished pemmican north in heavy Red River carts to be stored at major trading posts like Fort Garry, Cumberland House, and Edmonton House. The voyageurs, the French-Canadian canoemen who hauled beaver pelts and trade goods across thousands of miles of lakes and rivers, survived almost entirely on pemmican during their grueling supply runs. A standard North canoe with 6 men and 25 packs needed roughly 4 90-pound bags of pemmican for every 500 miles of travel. These men paddled from before dawn until after dark through summer heat that topped 100 degrees and mosquito swarms thick enough to make breathing difficult. In winter, they portaged between frozen waterways with 90-pound bags strapped to their backs, sometimes 2 at a time, across miles of deep snow. The only thing that made any of it possible was a food that delivered massive calories, weighed almost nothing compared to fresh provisions, and never went bad. Pemmican was so central to the culture of the Northwest fur trade that the voyageurs had a nickname for the men who stayed back east and never tasted it. They called them mangeurs de lard, pork eaters. It was not a compliment. A young Vermont-born trapper named Daniel Harmon wrote in his journal in August of 1800 that pemmican was palatable, nourishing, and healthy, and that the voyageurs subsisted on it while traveling through the country. For a New England man writing over 2 centuries ago, that was serious praise. If you're finding this interesting, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week, and the next one involves a piece of frontier technology that changed warfare on the plains forever. Now, anything that valuable doesn't stay out of politics for long, and Pemmican didn't. In January of 1814, the governor of the Red River Colony in what is now southern Manitoba, a man named Miles Macdonell, issued something called the Pemmican Proclamation. It banned the export of pemmican and dried meat from the colony's territory. On the surface, it looked like a sensible food security measure for a struggling settlement facing a harsh winter. But it wasn't about feeding settlers. It was an economic weapon aimed directly at the rival Northwest Company, whose entire network of trading posts and canoe brigades depended on the steady flow of Métis-produced pemmican coming north from the Red River region. Cut off the pemmican supply, and you cut off the Northwest Company's ability to operate across the entire interior of the continent. The Métis saw the proclamation as an attack on their livelihood, their culture, and their economic independence. The Northwest Company saw it as an act of warfare, and the response was exactly what happens when you threaten people's survival and their way of life at the same time. Armed confrontations broke out across the region almost immediately. Northwest Company agents and Métis hunters began raiding pemmican stores that had been seized under the proclamation. Macdonell's men retaliated by intercepting canoes and confiscating furs. Pemmican stores were seized at gunpoint, river blockades went up, trading posts were surrounded. The entire supply network that connected the interior of the continent to the Atlantic coast started breaking down, one confrontation at a time. The situation escalated for 2 years. Alliances shifted, threats became actions. And in June of 1816, it boiled over into a full-scale battle at a place called Seven Oaks, near the Red River settlement in what is now Winnipeg. A group of Métis fighters led by a man named Cuthbert Grant clashed with Hudson's Bay Company men led by Governor Robert Semple. When the shooting stopped, Semple and roughly 20 of his men lay dead on the field. Only one man on the Métis side was killed. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a war over gold or territory in the traditional sense. A mixture of dried meat and rendered animal fat caused a conflict that lasted nearly a decade, killed dozens of people, and permanently reshaped the political and economic landscape of Western Canada. The violence and chaos continued until 1821, when the British government finally forced the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company to merge under a single banner. That is how much pemmican mattered to the people who depended on it. But the story didn't end when the fur trade collapsed in the 1840s. Pemmican followed explorers to the most extreme places on the planet. When the great age of polar exploration began in the late 1800s, the men who ventured into the Arctic and Antarctic carried pemmican as their primary field ration. Roald Amundsen packed it on his successful push to the South Pole in 1911. Robert Peary and Matthew Henson carried it toward the North Pole. And when Ernest Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, was crushed by Antarctic sea ice in 1914, stranding his entire crew on the frozen pack ice hundreds of miles from any rescue, pemmican was one of the only foods they could rely on during the months they spent camped on drifting ice floes, waiting for the sea to open up enough to launch their lifeboats. Shackleton's men eventually sailed 800 miles across the most dangerous stretch of ocean on the planet in a 22-foot lifeboat to reach South Georgia Island. Pemmican went with them the entire way. The military saw the same potential the explorers did. The British Army included 4 ounces of pemmican alongside chocolate and sugar in a combat ration issued during the Boer War in South Africa at the turn of the 20th century. Frederick Russell Burnham, the American scout who served as chief of scouts for the British forces in that war, ordered every man under his command to carry pemmican in the field. Burnham had spent years in the American West and understood exactly what the mountain men had figured out decades earlier. When you're operating deep in hostile territory with no supply line, no guarantee of resupply, and no idea when your next meal is coming, pemmican is the difference between a unit that can still fight and one that is falling apart. Even into the 20th century, the United States military studied pemmican for extreme cold survival scenarios. A 1969 Army research study titled Arctic Survival Rations found that soldiers could stave off starvation during winter field operations on just 1,000 calories worth of pemmican per day. Nothing else available came close to that kind of efficiency. The mountain men did not invent pemmican. They did not improve on it. They adopted it wholesale from indigenous peoples who had spent generations perfecting a food that no modern equivalent has managed to replace. No freeze-dried meal, no military MRE, and no vacuum-sealed energy bar matches pemmican's combination of caloric density, nutritional balance, indefinite shelf life, and complete independence from technology or infrastructure. Fire gets the spotlight in every survival guide ever written, and fire matters. There is no question about that. But fire requires dry wood, safe conditions, time to build and maintain it, and the luxury of not being in territory controlled by people who will find you by the smoke. Pemmican needed none of those things. You could eat it in a blizzard. You could eat it while running barefoot across a cactus-covered plain with several hundred warriors behind you. You could eat it months or years after it was made, and it would keep your body moving forward when everything else in the wilderness was trying to kill you. Hugh Glass crawled 200 miles across the South Dakota prairie on grit and desperation. John Coulter ran naked through 6 miles of cactus on nothing but adrenaline. They survived through something close to superhuman willpower. But the men who lived long enough to tell their stories, the ones who went back into those mountains season after season and came out the other side, almost always had a pouch of pemmican on their belt. Next week, I'm covering another piece of forgotten frontier technology, one that the U.S. military spent decades trying to reverse engineer and never quite got right. Subscribe so you don't miss it.